Hello everyone, my name is Joseph and welcome to my in-depth Vault Filters guide. Now this video is going to be ordered from beginner to advanced and separated into 3 parts and a total of 8 chapters. And feel free to use the YouTube time bar below to move between them according to your needs. They should be marked. So let's get started with part 1, creating filters. Now the attribute filter and the list filter from the create mode are the basis of all filters. So let's start with the attribute filter. Now this is the attribute filter menu, and I know it looks kind of scary, but I'll go over everything. The first thing you'll notice is this item slot here. You can either drag an item to it from JEI or from your inventory, and then this will become a list of attributes that apply to the item. Now for example here I have an Omega gear piece, and one of its attributes is Omega gear piece. Now I can press here add attribute to list to add it. Now of course if I wanted to add an attribute for epic, I would have needed to put an epic earpiece into the filter. And of course rarity is just an example. You can filter by a lot of different attributes including affixes and many more. So now here I can see all of the attributes that apply to the filter. So now I'm going to put the filter in the attribute filter slot, and every time I put an item through the router, it's gonna check against that filter and see if it's Omega. Like so. These two are Omega, went to the top chest, and the other one went to the bottom chest. Alright, so from now on, to demonstrate whether an item is accepted by a filter or not, I will just drag the filter along in the inventory. Doing so will mark every item with a check mark or an X, depending on whether it matches the filter or doesn't match the filter. Alright, now let's see what else we can do with attributes. So I'm going to show you the add inverted attribute button. Here I'm going to take a scrappy helmet. I'm going to scroll down to a scrappy gearpiece item, and then instead of selecting this plus button of add attribute list, I'm going to press add opposite attribute list. Now what this does is basically add a flipped version of the attribute. So everything that is a scrappy gear piece is not going to be let through, and everything that isn't is going to be let through. So for example, if I hold this Omega piece can get through, but this scrappy piece doesn't. It's checking if it's not a scrappy gear piece. Now keep in mind that it's a complete opposite. So since this dirt is not a scrappy gear piece, it matches anyway. So make sure to cover all the bases. If you want just non-scrappy gear pieces, you're gonna have to use the match all feature, which I will cover later. Alright, so now I'm gonna cover the 3 options at the bottom left of the attribute filter, these 3. Now these 3 options are going to dictate what the filter will do with the results of all the attributes selected in it. I'm gonna start with allow list any, which is the default. Now let's say I have more than one attribute here. So for example, I'm going to select is an Omega gear piece and is an epic gear piece. Allow list any is essentially an OR gate. The filter will allow the item through if it matches at least one of the attributes selected. So if it's either an Omega or an epic gear piece. Now you can see here I'm going to test it against the items here. These are checkmarked, both epics and Omegas, and scrappies aren't. Next option is match all. Match all is essentially an AND gate. It will only let items through if all of the attributes apply to the item. So for example, I'm going to select as an epic gear piece and has a legendary modifier and select allow list all. Now it will only accept items that are both epic and legendary. So like here, this is a legendary, this is an epic, and these are X'd, while this one, which is an epic and legendary, does match. Now I'm going to move on to the deny list. Now I'm not going to show an example of this because it can be recreated by doing match all and inverting all the filters, but it basically only lets an item through if it matches none of the attributes. Now let's get started with chapter 2. And this is going to be a relatively small chapter, just covering some quality of life tricks you can use to better manage your filters. Now some of these tips also apply to the list filter, which I will cover in the next chapter, you can see whether they apply or not by looking at if I put a list filter to the right of the tip. Now let's start with filter clearing. If you have a filter and you want to clear it entirely because you're not happy with it, you could just put in the crafting grid and there you have it clear. Now if you want to just delete not the settings and the name but just the attributes or the contents of the filter, you can just press this delete button. And if you want to delete a single attribute, you can hover over the name tag to see all your attributes, scroll to select one, and hold delete to remove it. Like here, I accidentally add is placeable to my filter. I can hold and it's gone. Now let's move on to copying filters. If you have one filter that has data, whether it be a name, settings, attributes, and any count of filters that don't have data, and you put them all in a crafting grid, you can get the copies of the filter. Now if you want to copy just a specific attribute, so for example here I have an epic and legendary filter, and I want to get just the legendary attribute from it, I'm going to open the legendary attribute, and the filter I want to have legendary, and then scroll here and pick that has legendary modifier, because this lets me see all of its attributes. Now if I want to change the name of the filter, I heavily recommend naming all of your filters for organization purposes. Having every filter renamed attribute filter and having to look for it is a nightmare. So like here I named all of my filters epic and legendary based on what they need. So you can either rename them via Anvil or just name them here. Now let's move on to chapter 3, the list filter and filter nesting. Now the list filter itself has settings that are very similar to the attribute filter. It also has the allow list any and allow list all, but instead of accepting attributes, it accepts items. And when I say accept items, you can either accept items from your inventory or from JI again. Now items includes filters. So for example, if I set this to allow list any, then put omega here, and the filter I made earlier for is an epic and a legendary, this filter will do an allow list any, so we'll check if the item matches either of these, and then we'll only match if it's true. So this filter matches something that's either an epic and a legendary, or just an omega. Now of course this also works with match all. So for example here I have as an omega or is an epic from earlier, and here I have legendary. If I set the filter to allow list all and put these two, we only match filters that match both of these. So are both an omega or an epic and legendary. Like so, this is an omega, so it matches the omega or epic filter, and it's a legendary, so it matches the legendary filter. Likewise for here. When I said you can put filters inside the list filter, I didn't just mean attribute filters. List filters can also be inserted as well. So for example, I have this filter from earlier, and this is a new filter. I can put both of these here, and because this is set to match any, it's gonna match the item if it works with either of these. Now this can be chained endlessly. You can put list filters inside of list filters with attribute filters and essentially go forever. And using this, you're free to make any logic predicates you want and essentially make gigantic if statements. And since each filter either matches or doesn't, you can apply that down to the deepest level. Now this can quickly get messy, so here are 3 tips for management. Again, you should really rename your filters. It can make your life much easier. And you can hold control when hovering over a listed filter to show a nested version of the filter. Now if the filter is big, you might need to change your UI size, but that's usually not a problem. Another thing you could do is when opening the list filter, if you have a filter inside it, you can middle click the filter from inside it to open its menu and do changes without having to remake the filter in your inventory. Get started with part 2 of using filters. So you have made a filter, that's great. What can you do with it? So This chapter will cover slot compatibility and where the filters work. So since the filters are natively from Create, they of course work in the Create mod slots, but Vault Filters adds compatibility with filter slots from a lot of mods. Here are some examples. It works in pouch upgrades. So for example, you can put a pickup upgrade along with a filter that uses the tag attribute and filter for all chestlet. Now this is a tag that's added by Vault Filters. You can also use a void upgrade and check for the core to filter stuff like vault suites and ornate shards and stuff like that. You can also use the filter inside of any modular routers module, as well as the bulk item filters. Now you can also use the filters in any filter slot from Applied Energistics 2 or Refined Storage. Now that includes using export buses or exporters to pull bad gear from your system into their sectors. It also includes the filters for grids and the view cells. Now keep in mind that the filters work exactly like any other item would in filter slots, but instead of comparing if the two items are identical, it checks if the item is accepted by the filter. For example, if I set a puller to this chest and set the filter to whitelist dirt, every time the filter is ran, it's checking this chest and going through every item and checking if this item is identical to the item. So now, if I replace the whitelist with this attribute filter that says is placeable, it's going to go over every item and check if it's placeable. Let's go into item usage. What items can Vault Filters be used on? Now of course I'm not going to go over every single attribute, but along with all the attributes that already exist in the Create mod, Vault Filters add attributes for all the items on screen. Now feel free to check out the Curseforge page to see a full list of all the attributes, as well as a full list of all the custom tags that are added by the mod. So let's get started with card and jewel auto selection. So I'm going to demonstrate on jewels, but everything I do here applies to cards as well. Now to auto select from a jewel pouch, you're going to need modular routers, an activator module, and this jewel pouch opener augment. Now there's a counterpart for cards as well. So how does this work? Whenever any jewel pouch is run through an activator module that has this, first things first, no matter the filter, it's cracked open to be in this state. And then after it's cracked open, or if it was cracked open before, this filter, then 9 slots here. So for example, I'm going to put this filter legendary and whitelist is then ran over all of the options. Now if any of these, well not any of these, but the first one that matches them will be selected. So let's say this was legendary, then this activator module will pick it. Now in the case that there isn't a match, then it will stay as a jewel pouch. So two things can happen. It either finds a jewel and selects it, or it doesn't and it doesn't select it. So now let's get to using it. So here I have a system that pulls jewel pouches from here and then moves them to a bunch of activators. Now why am I using a priority system? Because I prefer legendaries over perfect jewels, and I prefer perfect jewels over hammer size. So what happens here is the jewel pouch goes through here. If there is a legendary, it immediately gets picked, sent to storage. If there isn't, it goes here and gets checked for perfect. And then if that's the case, it gets selected and sent to storage, same for hammering. And then if none of these match, then it will remain a jewel pouch and gets sent to this router, where it just picks a random thing and gets scrapped. So for example here, this is going to automatically go through jewels. Now keep in mind that you should put a security upgrade on at least the first activator that cracks the jewel open, or your jewel expertise is not going to apply. Alright, now let's get started with part 3, advanced usage. So I'm going to start with inner filters. Now there are some items that have items embedded inside them. For example, runes that have a reward, or open jewel pouches and card packs that have jewels and card packs inside them. Now this demonstration will be on runes, but it works the same for card packs and jewel pouches. Now here we have a rune with an omega chestplate as a reward. Now I can obviously just pick this is a rune that gives omega gear, and simple as that. But what if I want to do a more intricate filter? What if I want to use tags? What if I want to use other attributes? What if I want to check for specifically omega volt chestplates? So here I have a check for an omega chestplate. It's a match all for is a chestplate and is an omega, but it doesn't match this filter because while this has an unidentified omega volt chestplate, it's not an unidentified omega volt chestplate, it's a Barsh rune. So how do I make this filter check against the item inside it? I take another attribute filter, then this is an empty attribute filter, I put this inside it, and I select is a rune with a reward that matches omega chestplate. So this attribute essentially runs this filter on the reward of the rune. So now when I try it, it can run. Now when you do the same thing for card packs and jewel pouches, it will return true if any of the items inside of it match the filter. Alright, now let's get on with chapter 8. In this chapter, I will be making a complex card filter to filter for what I want, and I will explain the thought process while I'm making it. Now this is the only portion of the video that isn't scripted. I'm just gonna make it and explain the thoughts on the go. So here are some examples of evolution cards that I want. I want them to be either surrounding column or row, because diagonal and adjacent are kind of bad, and I want them to be able to scale on themselves, and by that I mean that they either scale by evolution or by their own color or by both. So let's get started. First things first, I'm gonna make a general list filter that says evo cards. Now, oh, I accidentally pinged. So now I need to decide what I want to start with. So I want to start with making sure it scales by the location modifier. So I'm okay with it scaling by either row, so I'm going to take a row filter, surrounding, or column. If it scales by, if it doesn't scale by any of these, I don't want it. So I'm going to make a filter. It has allow list any, because I'm okay if it does either one of these, and I'm going to call it scales column row or surround. Now I'm going to select is a card that scales based on row cards, is a card based on surrounding cards, and column cards. Alright, this is a start. But now I have to make sure that it scales by the right color. So first things first, if it doesn't scale by any color, for example this one doesn't scale by any color, then it's fine. So I'm going to start with doesn't scale by color. It scales no color. So how do I do that? I'm going to do a match all, and I'm going to take one that scales by yellow, one that scales by green, one that scales by blue, and one that scales by red. Alright, so is a card that scales based on yellow card. Oh, wait. I've made a mistake. I wanted to not scale based on red. Wanted to not scale based on yellow. Wanted to not scale based on green. Wanted to not scale based on blue. Now this means it scales, it doesn't scale by any color. Now the thing is, this if I put this here, then it's not going to accept any card that scales by a color, even if it scales by its own color, because this filter makes sure it doesn't scale by anything. So what I want is I want it to either scale by its own color or no color. So I just said either. So I'm going to use a list filter set to match any. So this list filter I'm going to call scales no color or same color, and it's going to be set to match any. Now this filter should be okay if it either doesn't scale by any color or scales by its own color. So what do I mean by scales by its own color? I'm going to take 4 attribute filters and then red scales red, so, and I'm going to set to match all. Now this will only match cards that scale based on red and are red. This is set to match true. This is going to be blue scales blue, and scales based on blue and is blue. And I did red, blue, now I need green and yellow. Green scales green, I'll list all, green, green, and yellow scales yellow, yellow, yellow. And now I'm gonna put these 4 in here. So now what does this filter do? It accepts any card that either scales by no color or scales by its own color. So it's match any, either no color or is a red that scales by red, blue scales by blue, and etc. So now I'm going to put this inside the Evo cards, and currently we have either it's color, row or surround, or and it scales by no color or the same color. So what are we missing? I want it to only scale based on evolution cards. So that means that either has a scaling based on evolution attribute, or it doesn't scale at all. Now there is a way to do that. So what I'm going to do is evolution cards can either scale based on stat, on resource, or on evolution. So if I make it, if I put here scales based on evolution, it's going to mandate that scales based on evolution, and it's not going to accept cards that only scale by color. So I want it to be, I want to make an attribute that does scales by Evo or by nothing. So it either scales by evolution or just, you know, colors. So how do I do that? I'm gonna eliminate all the other options. So I'm gonna take something that scales by resource. I'm gonna get something that scales by card. I'm gonna do scales based on stat cards and doesn't scale based on resource cards. So now because the 3 options are stat, resource, and evo, by saying is not a card that scales based on this and is not a card that scales based on that, you're leaving only either scaling based on nothing or scaling based on an evo. So now I'm gonna put this here. Let's go over everything. Wait, this should be allow list all. This is only gonna accept evo cards that scale on by column, row, or surround, that either scale by no color or the same color, and that scales by evolution or scales by nothing. Now let's go over the logic of the filter against one of the cards. So for example, if I look at this card, then for the first filter, column, row, surround, it matches because it scales by row. For the second filter, it goes to no color or same color. So because it doesn't match no color, it keeps checking, and it sees that it's green and scales by green. So the second filter is fine. Now the third filter scales by evo or nothing. It doesn't scale based on stat, it doesn't scale based on resource, so it's fine. Now let's see this filter. This filter scales by column, and it doesn't, so the first filter is correct, and then the second filter matches true because it scales by no color, but then the third filter returns false because it scales based on a stat card. Now this will only allow through cards that can scale by themselves. So this is it for the tutorial. I hope you learned a lot, and goodbye.